In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. Some stories don't end. They just go quiet for a while. And then something shifts. A bone turns in the earth, a file gets opened, a name surfaces in an old ledger, and suddenly the past is standing in the room with you again, breathing.
Welcome to Reverberating Noir.
Tonight, we go back to a December evening in Madrid, the year 1870, a carriage moving through wet, gaslit streets, and a man inside it who, in a matter of days, would be dead, and a country that would spend the next century paying for it.
The case of Juan Prim, soldier, revolutionary, the most powerful man in Spain, and one of the most consequential political assassinations you've probably never heard of.
What we know for certain could fill a pamphlet. What we suspect, what the evidence suggests that fills something darker, something that doesn't have a clean ending. Because this case was reopened in 2012. Forensic scientists, CT scans, a 140-year-old grave. And what they found changed the question entirely.
The question stopped being who shot him. It became, did the shooting even kill him?
Let's go back to the beginning. Juan Prim was born in 1814 in Reus, a small sun-baked town in Catalonia. Not a place that produces legends, typically. But Prim was not a typical man. He was a soldier from the ground up. Not a drawing-room general. A man who fought Carlist rebels in mountain passes, who led troops across the Saharan edge of Morocco, who tangled with French imperial forces in Mexico, and walked away standing. He had the kind of gravity that makes other men step aside without quite knowing why.
By the time he reached the height of his power, he wasn't just a military figure, he was a political architect. And in 1868, he became the primary force behind what Spain called La Gloriosa, the Glorious Revolution, the movement that removed Queen Isabella II from the throne.
Now, understand what that took. Spain at that moment was fractured almost beyond recognition. Carlists in the north, Republicans in the cities, Bourbon loyalists still whispering in the corridors, generals with private armies and private agendas, and Prim walked into the middle of all of it and said, "I can hold this together."
He wasn't just choosing a new king, he was attempting something genuinely rare in that era, a managed transition, a constitutional monarchy that could absorb the pressure from all sides without collapsing. He spent 2 years negotiating, cajoling, threatening, persuading. He finally settled on Amadeo, a liberal Italian prince from the House of Savoy. No Spanish blood feuds, no inherited enemies. A clean slate.
And that's what made Prim uniquely dangerous. He wasn't just a general. He wasn't just a politician. He was the only man in Spain who could talk to all of them. The bridge between worlds that despised each other. And when you are the only bridge, you become a target from every shore.
The list of people who wanted Prim gone wasn't short. Republicans who saw a constitutional monarchy as a betrayal, Bourbon loyalists who wanted Isabella's line restored, rival generals Serrano, to Pete men who'd been sidelined by Prim's dominance. The Duke of Montpensier, whose own claim to the throne Prim had personally crushed. Take your pick. History offered options.
The 30th of December, 1870. Madrid, evening. The streets are slicked with winter rain. Gas lamps throwing long, unsteady shadows across the cobblestones. Prim's carriage moves through the narrow passage between the Calle del Turco and the Calle del Alcalá, open-topped, unguarded.
That detail matters. A man of his stature, his profile, his known enemies moving through the city in an open carriage, with no meaningful protection. Either he was reckless, or someone had ensured the route was clear of the wrong kind of attention.
The night explodes, gunfire from the shadows, a coordinated volley, not one shooter, not a lone grievance, multiple weapons, multiple positions, Someone had planned this. And through the chaos, through the blood and the noise and the panic of his attendants, Prim's voice rises above it all. Don't kill them, don't kill them, it doesn't matter.
He was wounded. Badly. A bullet through the arm, another tearing through his shoulder, shattering bone, severing arteries. He was taken to the war ministry. Doctors attended him. And for 3 days, it seemed like he might survive.
Amadeo arrived in Spain on the 2nd of January, 1871. Prim heard the news. By some accounts, he managed something close to a smile. He thought he'd done it. He thought the plan had held.
He died the same day. The official cause listed was septicemia, blood poisoning from the wounds. But even at the time, the records were imprecise, murmured. The kind of documentation that leaves room.
And then the real unraveling began. Without Prim, the coalition he had built with sheer personal force simply dissolved. Amadeo arrived to a throne with no one guarding it. The progressives turned on the Unionists. The Republicans sensed weakness and moved. The Bourbon loyalists started making promises in the shadows again.
Amadeo abdicated in 1873, less than 2 years after taking the throne. His exact words, reportedly, were something close to, "I am not fit to be king of this madhouse." Then came the First Spanish Republic, which lasted less than a year before collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Then the Bourbons returned.
And the spiral continued. For decades. For generations. You can draw a line. Not a straight one, but a line from that carriage in the Calle del Turco to the Civil War, to Franco, to everything that came after. That's not hyperbole. That's what happens when you remove the one person holding a fragile structure together. The structure doesn't adapt. It falls.
Arrests were made in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. Men named Paul Fernandez Garcia, figures from the Republican fringe. But even contemporaries noted something hollow about those proceedings. The right people were being seen to act. Whether the right people were actually being charged, that was a different question.
The kind of question that gets quietly set aside when it becomes inconvenient. We know that feeling. History is full of it.
Which brings us to December of 2012.
140 years after the assassination, a team of forensic scientists, historians and criminologists gathered in Royce over Prim's grave. With modern tools that the 19th century couldn't have imagined, CT scanning, DNA analysis, detailed osteological examination, and a simple, devastating question, what actually killed this man?
The original autopsy findings held up. Initially, 2 significant bullet wounds, the shoulder injury consistent with the account's bone damage, arterial involvement, the kind of wound that kills slowly, through infection, through blood loss, through the body simply running out of capacity to repair itself. Septicemia remained plausible.
And then they found the hyoid.
The hyoid bone, a small U-shaped structure in the neck. It sits at the base of the tongue. It has no direct articulation with any other bone in the body. It's suspended in soft tissue, which means it doesn't fracture easily. It fractures under very specific kinds of pressure.
The kind of pressure that comes from a hand around a throat.
That's one interpretation, and it's the one that immediately dominated the conversation after 2012. But the forensic team was careful, and that carefulness is important. The body had been moved, reburied in 1921, disturbed multiple times over 14 decades. A hyoid fracture can occur post-mortem from soil compression, from the physical handling of remains, from a coffin shifted by gravediggers who didn't know what they were carrying.
Inconclusive. That word. It's the most unsettling word in any investigation, because it doesn't mean nothing happened. It means we can't prove what happened. And those are very different things.
What the 2012 investigation gave us wasn't a verdict. It gave us a revised question. Because if that fracture is ante-mortem, if someone did place hands on Prim while he lay wounded and helpless in the war ministry, then we're not looking at an assassination carried out in the streets by gunmen. We're looking at something that required access, proximity, trust.
Someone in that room. Someone he may have known.
Which reframes the entire case. The gunmen in the alley, whoever they were, whoever sent them, may have only been the first act. The second act happened quietly, in a building full of people, where everyone was focused on the wound in his shoulder, and no one was watching his neck.
I want to stay with that image for a moment, because it's the part of this story that doesn't let go. Prim had survived battlefields. He had survived colonial campaigns and political exile and coup attempts. He had survived the opening act of his own assassination. And if the evidence points where some researchers believe it points, he was finally taken not by the men in the dark street, but by someone who walked through a door, someone with a reason to be there.
That's the pattern that recurs in political assassinations of this era. The public act, the spectacle of violence, draws all the attention. The investigation focuses on the shooters, the weapons, the route, the conspiracy behind the attack. And while everyone is looking at the explosion, something quieter happens. Something that leaves less evidence. Something that requires less coordination and more nerve.
History is very good at hiding the second act.
It is. And what's disturbing about Prim specifically is that the second act, if it happened, would have required institutional complicity. Not just one person with a motive, but a surrounding environment where the right questions weren't asked, where the right doors weren't locked, where the right people looked away at the right moment. That's not a lone killer. That's a system.
And systems don't leave fingerprints. The arrests made after the shooting were never fully prosecuted. The trial records are fragmentary. The men who were charged either died before proceedings concluded or were released under circumstances that history recorded with minimal detail. The file, effectively, was never closed. It was simply set down.
Which is itself a form of answer. Not the answer to who did it, but the answer to who had the power to make sure we'd never know. Because investigations don't fail by accident at that level. They fail because someone with authority decides they should.
Prim's last words in the carriage. Don't kill them. It doesn't matter. I've turned that over many times. There's a reading of it that's purely tactical, a wounded general trying to prevent his men from creating martyrs, from escalating a crisis. There's a reading that's almost philosophical, a man who understood, in that moment, that revenge would only deepen the wound.
And there's a third reading. A man who already knew that the men in the alley weren't the real danger, that catching them wouldn't change anything. That the thing he was fighting, the resistance to everything he was trying to build, wasn't something you could arrest.
Maybe all three are true. What most people take from Prim's story when they encounter it at all is the political collapse, the failure of the First Republic, the return of the Bourbons, the chaos. They read it as a story about instability, about Spain's particular difficulty with modernity.
But that framing obscures something more uncomfortable. Prim wasn't removed because Spain was ungovernable. He was removed because he was governing. Because he was succeeding, imperfectly but genuinely, at something that threatened too many entrenched interests simultaneously. The instability that followed wasn't a pre-existing condition. It was manufactured by his absence.
That's the part that reverberates. Not the bullet, not even the hand at the throat if that's what happened, but the deliberate creation of a void. And the knowledge that someone, somewhere, understood exactly what would rush in to fill it.
That's a template. Not unique to 1870, not unique to Spain. Remove the bridge builder. Let the factions tear each other apart. Step in when the exhaustion is total. It's a strategy, as old as power itself. And it works precisely because it's invisible. Because history records the chaos, not the hand that opened the gate.
The forensic team in 2012 didn't solve the murder of Juan Prim. They weren't able to. The evidence was too old, too disturbed, too buried under the weight of time and reinterment, and the ordinary violence that history does to the dead.
But they did something else. They proved that the question was still alive, that 140 years of silence hadn't settled it, that the official story, gunshot wounds, septicemia, tragic loss contained a gap, a small U-shaped gap in a neck bone, and gaps don't close themselves.
That's the nature of this kind of case, the kind we come back to, here, in this space. Because the most dangerous stories aren't the ones where we know who did it. They're the ones where we almost know, where the evidence takes us to a door and then stops, where the answer existed in a room we can no longer enter. Prim died believing he had pulled it off, that Spain had its king, its constitution, its chance. He was wrong. But not because the idea was wrong, because the people who needed him to fail were more patient than the people who needed him to succeed. They waited. They planned. They moved through the shadows of a December night. And then, perhaps, through a doorway in the war ministry. Quietly, without witnesses. History doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes the whisper is all that's left. If this case stayed with you, if that image of a man in a carriage shouting "Don't kill them" into the dark is still sitting somewhere in your chest, then you're exactly where Reverberating Noir is meant to take you. Subscribe, stay close. Because the cases we cover here don't end when the episode does. They follow you. That's the point.
The hyoid fracture in Prim's remains was classified as inconclusive in 2012. No follow-up forensic investigation has been formally commissioned since. The case remains officially unsolved. And the people who knew the answer, every one of them died having never said it aloud. Which means the silence was a choice. And choices like that don't just protect secrets. They protect the people who made them. Some of whom, by the logic of history, got exactly what they wanted.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.